I want to challenge everybody with a very specific challenge, which is evaluate everyone on the team. Who would you not feel comfortable giving direct negative feedback to or getting direct negative feedback from? It probably comes down to the trust battery thing. It's likely something along the lines of you haven't spent enough time talking with them or interacting with them in a way that you feel you have the role or right, so to speak, to give them negative feedback, or that you would feel comfortable being challenged by them. Pretty important, because again, you want to be in a position to be able to help everyone on the team and vice versa, and be comfortable receiving that feedback. Where is your trust battery? You can even draw it out if you want, or like imagine the level of charge in a trust battery. Like, how much do you think, how close to 100% are you? And remember that these things don't stay charged. You might work with someone closely, and maybe at some point in the future, they're working on different projects, create some space. That trust battery is not going to stay charged necessarily. It's not that we dislike each other. It's just that you haven't worked closely together and it's not as familiar. So constantly evaluating, how you can keep that level as high as you can, especially with people that we work closely with. And as managers and as direct reports, that paradigm, we have to keep the trust batteries high. Otherwise, things go south.
What's the goal of feedback? From your perspective, what does no rules say about it? How have we seen it actioned in our culture? What are your general approach there?
No Rules, which was a book we did for our book club. It's based on the Netflix culture, and they've got a really nice model on the idea of giving and receiving feedback. So the 4 A's are: aim to assist with feedback, make sure that feedback is actionable. This is on the giving end. On the receiving end, you appreciate the feedback, and then you have the opportunity or the decision to make whether you accept or discard. And there's nuance to all of this. If you think you would have trouble giving somebody feedback, it's likely that the two of you have a trust battery issue. If I feel that I can't give you feedback and I'm unsure why, there's probably a deeper rooted trust battery issue that needs to be resolved in order to get the monkey off the back, clear the table. Let's make sure we're good. If you withhold feedback because you're trying to be sensitive towards a person and say, well, I don't know how Ms. is going to receive this, and you hold on to it, you might end up building up resentment towards that person, because you're like, they keep doing this thing that you want to give them feedback on, and then you don't. And then you feel like it's too far gone. It's like past the point. We did this project ages ago. And instead of hitting the nail on the head and just being honest about it, all of these micro things start to take away the trust battery. And that causes a ton of issues. This feedback is no longer timely, and you think I can't give it anymore. It's like, did you ever listen to Reply All when PJ came up with that idea of email debt forgiveness day? When you haven't sent an email and you're like, oh, I should have sent that, and a week goes by and 2 weeks, and then next thing you know, you're like, I can't send that email to the person to let them know sorry or to follow up. I'll just let it fizzle. And it's 3 months later. Well, sometimes you can go years, and these little things dwell and weigh on you because you're like, remember when I didn't email Ms. and it's 18 months later and you're still thinking about it. Feedback can be the same way, where it's you wish you would have just told the person this thing, and then you can put it behind you and move on. Otherwise, over time, this compounds and compounds, and a lot of debt is accumulated with this, as far as we'll call it trust debt, honesty debt, transparency debt between two people, between a team. It really builds up, and that causes friction in working relationships or personal relationships too.
The thing that I think is helpful is just to remember that volume of feedback is helpful. The more feedback you give, regardless of how small, really adds up and gets you in the habit of closing the loop constantly, making sure that people know that things are seen, and watching the line between where things get petty and don't actually help versus areas where you're not sure if they fully grasp the concept. You want to make sure that the point is landed. Can often lead to very interesting conversations where you assume someone might know something, but the very nature of bringing it up opens the conversation and can snowball into something else completely that's very interesting. And so volume of giving microfeedback is very helpful, so long as it's through the lens of assisting and also understanding where you are on the trust battery and having situational awareness of what you're delivering as the sender and where the receiver is at that moment in time. It's pretty important to consider. And I think this just goes more broadly to building relationships with the people you work with so that you're understood, and so that feedback, positive, critical, is understood in context, and the motivation is clear as well behind the person sending, so that there's no misunderstandings and there's context to the relationship that matters. And so just using this framework of delivering pieces of positive feedback along the way is a great way to build a relationship and keep it genuine.
one of the hardest things about giving feedback is this idea of the person who is giving it has to understand the type of feedback that they're giving and why they're giving it. So there are two types of feedback. One is objective and one is subjective. So objective feedback would be, and let's go extreme on this. Hey, Miz, you broke the law by breaking into somebody's car. That's against the law. That's objectively wrong. I wanted to let you know that's wrong. That's very objective, right? Subjective is like, hey, Miz, you wore clown shoes to a meeting. I don't really like the shoes, but people might have thought that they were inappropriate. When people might not take you as seriously, it's subjective, but framing it as I've got some feedback for you, it's subjective, but here it is. So then as a receiver, you can know the place that it's coming from, and you might be more receptive to objective feedback than subjective. There's a difference between opinion and feedback. Opinion is the way you view what somebody else does, and the way that that you interpret it is much different than giving feedback on it. That's where understanding that not all feedback is feedback, when deciding whether or not to receive or discard that feedback.
There's something about knowing if the feedback that you're giving is more a reflection of your own preferences or approach versus whether or not it actually results in a better outcome. So I might be a real stickler for use of the Oxford comma, but this person writes without it and double spaces after their periods, right? Like that's a peeve that I've got. Is my feedback giving just related to my style and approach here, or does it actually have something related to outcome and execution that matters? This reminds me, there's a funny story that I always think about when it comes back to this. Back in the days when I was on Twitter, I'm not there anymore.
Yes, you are.
And I tweeted on daylight savings time, finally, people won't be wrong when saying EST versus ET, because people always kind of just like add in extra letters there. And then some random guy responded and he said, finally, people who drink too much coffee won't freak out when I say EST. I was like, oh, point taken. This doesn't really matter. And it was kind of like one of those funny Twitter exchanges, but there's relevance here and just like making sure that the things you're pointing out actually matter, not getting stuck in details that don't really tie to any outcomes that are meaningful, right? So like keep a lighthearted about all this. It's all just us being people. And it's very easy to get too serious and too carried away when you're delivering feedback. But I always remember this one of just someone calling me out for being overly ridiculous.
Or is it on them though? For whatever reason, some people can be harder to give feedback to. They're not willing to appreciate that you're trying to be helpful. You're aiming to assist, trying to give actionable feedback, especially when it's objective, and people take it personal. And this is a really hard thing. And I think this is just working through things from an emotional intelligence perspective, where it's like everyone is going to receive feedback differently, and knowing how to approach those conversations on a case-by-case basis, because there really is not a good way of doing it. So meaning you and I are recording a video, and the last time we did it, you had your lights off and you had a grainy camera and you were in a room with a ton of reverb. And I give very objective feedback and said, hey, Miz, I wanted to let you know the last time we recorded this video, the quality wasn't there. And here were the things that was wrong with it: the lighting, the audio quality, the camera. Here's how to fix it. It doesn't matter that it was like that for the last video, but for this one, we should do step 1, 2, and 3. And you on the receiving end take it very personal, like it's an attack, or you take it like you get defensive about it. And that gets really hard, because you almost need to, and this gets into the trust battery thing, where you have to have these open conversations and say, I understand it might be sensitive, but like, let's talk about this because it's feeling off right now. Like, let's not let this just bury it under the rug and we walk away like you got feedback and you pretended to appreciate it, but you really didn't. That's where I think it's worth having a deeper conversation to get to the root of a problem.
Yeah. And there are some things that we can do to make that a little bit easier. There's things to consider. A person might have certain sensitivities or sore spots where, like, if you're calling something out and it's something they already know about, something they're very mindful of, you can come in from left field and have no idea that they've thought about that or that they're a little bit sensitive about it, and just deliver objective or subjective feedback without realizing that it's sensitive. And so what I think we've done that's helpful, that we've taken inspiration from other places, is user guides where people communicate what they're about, what their challenges are, how to support them. And so if you see in someone's thing that like they take criticism about their writing particularly strongly, you might approach that differently versus just considering it's a blank playing field and you can come in with anything. And so if it's a sore spot for me in that example, that like, ooh, I don't have a place to record and it was stressing me out all day to like find the right setting, and then you come in and tell me that the setting I found was bad, that lands roughly, and then there's some like ego separation that has to happen in order to receive that feedback in a way that that's effective. And so being aware of the environment is helpful, and understanding who you're delivering the feedback to the trust battery piece, but also to just the interpersonal side, is what helps quite a bit.
In order to be receptive to feedback, you have to strip away ego altogether. Like in general, as human beings, we're better off by stripping away ego. Like we just are. Insecurity is driven by ego because we're worried about the way that we are going to come across in a certain situation. And so that's actually our ego telling us, not to get too philosophical and Freudian on this, but that's our ego actually driving these insecurities, saying like, oh my goodness, I'm not good enough. And it's like, no, that's not what a person's saying. And one thing is the idea of seeking out feedback too. So if you are doing something and you're unsure, great opportunity to seek out feedback. Now, even if you are Michael Jordan and you mastered the chest pass, right? Or so you think, there's a reason why you are constantly working on form. So even if you have spent a lot of time doing a certain task, doing a certain thing, you might say, hey, do you see anything off about my form here? Is there something I can tweak? And that can be helpful too, because you can't see your own chest pass, but somebody else can see the way that your arms are holding the ball and pushing it out. And you say, yeah, actually, if you just move your arm back in, it's going to be a neutral position to do that chest pass. And you'll probably you won't injure your arm, or you'll get a lot better control and force out of it. And so it doesn't matter how experienced somebody is, like being able to seek out micro feedback about performance, even when you have done something for many years. It's actually probably a better opportunity to seek it out, because then you fall into the trap of thinking like, well, I know how to do this already. And there's never a point where anyone has mastered feedback. It's like, being able to give and receive feedback well is a lifelong lesson. It's like you always are getting better and better at it because it's just really hard to do.